I'd like to welcome everybody to today's OGS webinar, uh, Hidden Gems in the News, Discoveries with GenealogyBank, being presented by Melony Young of GenealogyBank. Just a reminder, as we get started here, if you'd please keep your microphones muted during the course of the program. If you have any questions for Melony during the program, please put them in the chat and we will answer them at the end of the program. Not during, but at the end. So thank you. And without any further ado, I'll turn it over to Melony. Thank you, Melony, for being here today.
It's my pleasure, Noel. Thanks so much for inviting us. Genealogy Bank loves the opportunity to speak directly with genealogy societies. This is about the fourth one that I've done this month. And this presentation, it's going to cover a lot of information. We actually do go over some of the basics that most researchers know, but I'm also going to show you some areas that you'll find unexpected, um, really great clues that can help you with brick walls that, can just help lead you to that next step. We're always trying to find that next ancestor, that next relative down the line, or, more so telling the story. I presented some of this information at Roots Tech last year, and honestly, I was pretty surprised at how many people came up to me and said that they had learned something new, particularly who some of those people were, because they were people that I respect well in the genealogy space. So without further ado, I will jump in. So the title of my presentation is Hidden Gems in Newspapers. That's what we'll be talking about. And newspapers are a very valuable tool when we're doing family history research. And, I think most of us understand that, but I want to start with a bit of history about newspapers. So in the United States, the first newspaper was published in 1690 in Boston, Massachusetts. That newspaper is actually something that we host on the site genealogybank.com, and I've got an image of it here on the screen. What's interesting about this is that it was only one issue because the government did not like their political point of view and shut them down immediately. Of course, the news came back. Maybe they rebranded or approached things differently and proceeded. And then, of course, newspapers started popping up everywhere. And it wasn't until 1880 that radio was invented. TV didn't come along until 1927. So for 190 years, newspapers were our primary source for entertainment, news, gossip, and news traveled. And when people traveled, the news traveled with them. And so you can learn so much about what happened with your relatives, your ancestors, in certain time periods, and you may find them in unexpected areas. We all understand the building blocks of family history in newspapers. So most of the time we're looking for birth announcements, marriage announcements, obituaries, and death announcements. And those are great for the names and the dates, which, again, the building blocks, that's how you put together your pedigree chart. So we're always looking for those, but there's so much more. Birth announcements give us the basic criteria of names, dates, locations, addresses, hospitals, family information. They vary. They can be very small mentions or they can be more detailed. In most cases, what I find in birth announcements is they are abbreviated. They are pretty short, but they do at least give you the names and the dates and give you more information to go on. They don't always list the name of the baby, but they are great for the timestamp. Marriage announcements are a whole different world, though. I love them. They go so far beyond the name and the date, especially if the family had, any kind of status or wealth, then they would really do these big, big write-ups about them. But they tell us more than we might expect. So we've got the names here of the bride and groom, of course, the names of their parents, sometimes the extended family, people in the wedding party. In fact, I found an article about an uncle during my research where he was listed as a groomsman in someone else's wedding announcement. And so these are great when they start mentioning who was in the wedding party. If anyone notable attended, they of course mention them because that's a story. That's a big deal. They often give street addresses, especially when we're pre-privacy laws. So they can give you great information about location. They very often talk about military careers, especially in military wedding announcements. They talk about where they would be stationed. You can learn, which branch of the military that they're in. You can learn about where they went to school, church, where they intend to work, where they're going on their honeymoon, where they're planning to move after their honeymoon. And so there are a wealth of information that can get you acquainted with your family. It can help you start telling the story and understand their life. They often talk about fashion and how it was decorated, what kind of music was being played, what kind of flowers were on the table. So they are just really, really rich. But what I find in many of them is it also includes some ethnic information. So in the marriage announcement on the far left with the photos, both of these both the bride and groom were members of different Native American tribes. And so this mentions their tribal heritage. Now, when we look at this photo, we may not make that assumption. And so it's very important that when we're looking at these, we are capturing those details because we see that the bride was from the Cherokee tribe and the groom was from the Chippewa tribe. And so then, you can learn not just about who's in your family tree, but where they're from and learn about their culture. And they're just beautiful when they contain that information. Death notices and obituaries are the gold standard. Everyone uses them. And if you're not, we need to talk. But they range from, they can look like many things. I've seen them span an entire page of a newspaper. I have seen them be a brief mention. I've seen them not exist at all. Nowadays, we're seeing more funeral notices. So that's a instead of incurring an additional cost of a newspaper obituary, people are adding it to their funeral services. So that's part of the package that they get where the funeral service will create that notification. Often it's on a website. The links get copied to social media sites and they are, very often found online. In many cases, families will also ask the funeral home to submit it to a local newspaper. And so it can be different and it really just depends on what the family is willing and able to spend on the obituary that drives the information that you get. But when you're lucky, they contain photos and a life story. They contain that rich eulogy that gives you information about family, life, career, location. And those, of course, we know we struck gold when we get those. But we also need to understand where to look for them. They're not always categorized as an obituary. So this mention in the center where we just see the mentions, those are actually newspaper articles. So it's important when you are on a site that may group its collection, so it may allow you to search just in obituaries, that you expand your search to just regular newspaper articles because it might be hidden in there as just a brief mention. So on the far right, lower, that's a newspaper article as well. And it mentions an ethnic group that, may not normally have an obituary for that time period. And so these are really important to understand your newspapers and how they work, and also understand the way that those might be published for the time period that you're looking in. So cultural knowledge comes in handy as well. Sometimes we just see these little columns that say deaths announced today, and it gives you just very brief information, the name and the age. Those are still good clues because you can continue to look in other types of records for that. But, if you're just looking for the names, the dates, then this is sufficient enough. Of course, we want to know, we want to know our family tree a little better. So when, we're always going to be looking for more information. The fun fact is that the average obituary lists 7 family members. So that's just an average. That's not always the case. Some people have big families, some people have small families. But if you can get the next 7 people in the family tree that you're looking for, that's always a gift because each person you find is another clue along the path. Now, going beyond the names and dates, so beyond the big 3, I've got some ideas to share with you that maybe you haven't looked in before. The first one is anniversary celebrations. So if you're if the couple that you're researching did not have a big wedding announcement, or even if they did, what you may find is an anniversary celebration. So you may find something for their 10th, 25th, 50th, 60th, 40th wedding anniversary where the family got together and had a party for them. And these I find are almost better than finding an actual wedding announcement because the wedding announcement might be brief, but these are typically very complete articles full of information that really goes through a life story. So it gives you a great timeline from the time they were married and very often before. So it might give you a little bit of background on who they were, where they came from before they met. But then it goes through that whole history of their life, where they got married, where they lived, what kind of careers they had, the names of their children and grandchildren. And it just tells you about them and what they did, how they were viewed in society. And these are often written by children, so they're very loving. They will mention if somebody else hosted it, or you can get the location of where the party, the ceremony, celebration was held. And it's just, these are just so neat. They also go into, very often say some of the similar things you might find in a wedding of who attended and how it was decorated, what the theme was, or if there was music or notable guests. So it's really neat to find these. Of course, not every family does this, nor do they announce it when they do. But when they are available, it's just so amazing to find these. They can give you a lot of missing information or additional information. Likewise, celebrations of birthdays are a lot of fun to find. So they may happen even after someone has passed away on what would have been a milestone birthday, but very often it's just the same type of situation. The children of this person or the grandchildren held a party to honor them on this milestone birthday and wrote about their life. So you may find exactly the same information as you would in an anniversary. It's just dedicated to one individual, but you may still have the names, the mentions of their friends, their family, their careers, their life accomplishments, and you learn a little bit about how people felt about them, which is difficult to understand unless you start getting the stories. So these can be a wealth of information when they are available to you. This is just a great example of one that I found. Her name is Mary Lyon. This is a full page, and various people wrote tributes to her and this is 1897. So it was a full newspaper page where people just wrote about their experience, their memory with Mary Lyon. It's the most beautiful tribute. It would have been her 100th birthday. So if Mary Lyon is related to you, if Mary Lyon's in your family tree, what could you learn by finding something like this in newspapers? And, this is where we go from, you know, just the names and dates to telling the stories and finding those similarities, discovering that you had something in common with that ancestor. And, that's my favorite part about this work. The next best thing, and never underrate these because they are so fun, are the society and gossip columns. So these are tricky to find sometimes because you don't always have the right name. So adding keywords when you're looking for a name, like visited, to your search criteria can help these surface for you when you're doing the searches, because newspaper searching is a entirely different seminar on how to do it correctly. But adding a keyword like visited into your search criteria can help these pop up for you. But very often these are about women, and women ancestors can be difficult because we don't always know how their name was listed. So these are great for finding maiden names. They're also great for finding details. So let's say we couldn't find a birth announcement, but we can find them sometimes in these gossip columns. So I want to just go through these a little bit and break them down. So the first one on the left, Mrs. Fred W. Burkhart, formerly Lillian Spaeth. So if you were looking for Lillian, and you just couldn't find her because she was listed as Mrs. Fred W. Burkhardt or Mrs. F.W. Burkhardt or in any other iteration, or maybe she went by Lily, um, or you knew her as Lily in your life, you might not be finding these things, or you might not know the maiden name or things like that. So you can find that. The next line is arrived Sunday with her baby daughter, Joanna. So that is a birth announcement if you couldn't find anything else. So now you've got the daughter, you've got the date of this publication. So you can kind of do the math and you know the daughter's name from her home in San Gabriel, California. So if you didn't know that she was in California, there's your clue. For an indefinite summer visit with her mother, Mrs. F. Spade, and then gives the address. So if Lillian was a mystery to you, you've just got a bunch of clues here. And then it says several parties are being planned in her honor. This is her first visit to Dallas in more than 3 years. So we just learned that she got married. She moved to California. She hasn't been to visit mom and dad in 3 years, but she brought the baby and she's staying for the summer so mom can help her with the baby. And I just love knowing that. And I think that it's also good information. This is a very short article, but look what it contains. On the right, we have Miss Gladys Arbuckle of Salt Lake City is here visiting with her sister, Mrs. Dawn Coppin. And this is just another Utah newspaper. So she went from Salt Lake to Cedar City. For those of you that don't know Utah, that's about a 4-hour drive. So that must have been a very big deal back then. But we know that she is single. She's a miss. But if we were looking for Mrs. Dawn Coppin's maiden name, now we've got Miss Arbuckle to kind of help it out. So sometimes these are a bit of reverse engineering to get the maiden names, but you can often find them here. And then the third one, Mrs. Kathy Johnson, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. William Webster, gave birth to a baby boy Wednesday, mother and babe doing nicely. So if you knew Kathy Johnson as Mrs. Johnson, but didn't know her maiden name, now you've got Mr. and Mrs. William Webster. You can kind of make that assumption and do some digging to verify it. So the gossip columns are great in so many ways. And this is the smallest set of examples. I could give you just hundreds and hundreds of examples like this that contain really great information. Legal notices as well can give you the same type of snippet of information in an unexpected area. So on the lower left, if Thomas Mansfield and Miss Elizabeth Crawford did not have a wedding announcement, this legal notice that the clerk issued a marriage license can, and may be the only clue that's available for you. But then you at least know which county, which area to go to the county recorder to look for that marriage certificate. So it might be just these little things that fill in the gaps for you. So never pass them by. Also, articles about the law can give you information. So these are just two random news articles about adoption law, but it also talks, in them we get names. Remember, every news story is about someone, right? And that someone is somebody's ancestor or relative. So you can learn about how people influence things when we're looking at adoption records and adoption notices. Obviously, adopted children are very difficult and challenging in family tree work. And, sometimes just looking through these legal notices instead of trying to isolate a birth record or a different type of news article, then you may find what you're looking for. Legal notices are the same type of keyword. Put in legal notice in quotations in the keyword field, and these may come up for you because they just might be categorized and labeled differently on the site. And any newspaper site is going to tag their articles as a news article, an obituary, a legal notice, etc. Depending on the site. It can vary, of course. So being a little bit more specific in your search can help these surface, and then you may find the names that you're looking for. And a lot of people don't, I've heard this. We're at Roots Tech every year. I present every year. And a lot of people are like, I don't really think about newspaper articles and I just want to talk to them. And I end up talking to them for quite a while. But here's what you can find in the simplest of newspaper articles. Now, Charlene Clauser is my late mother-in-law. When she passed away last year, my husband, as husbands do, said, My mom won a beauty contest sometime in the early 60s. I'd love to find something like that for her funeral. Can you look on your site? Sure, honey. What was it called? I don't know, something with wings. And I'm like, okay. So I went into research mode, did some digging. I'm going to share a little bit about that digging later on in this presentation. But I found this article and I was stunned at the information in it. So I knew she talked about her beauty pageant days pretty often. Those were, she was very proud of her modeling and beauty pageant, little career. And but I realized from, looking at this through the lens of working for a newspaper archive site like Genealogy Bank, um, that this is a wealth of information in itself. And I know this is very busy, but this article is very short. But it says the first thing Charlene Cloudser, 22, did after winning the Miss Wings of 1961's title in Long Beach, California, was to call Chicago. She spoke to her mother, and then it lists mother's name, mother's address, her brother, and what city he lived in. It talks about where she worked, where she lived. If you didn't know her maiden name, if you didn't know how old she was. This article was in 1961. She was 22 years old. You can start doing the math to figure it out. You can see that, okay, mom lived in Chicago. Maybe she grew up there. Maybe that's a clue for me. Denver, what did she do in Denver? Turns out she got married in Denver. And, there's was a whole bunch of information there. And this gives a tiny bit of insight about her sense of humor. Obviously, I was privileged to know her in life, but this gave me more information that we hadn't talked about. So this is just a short little article, but look at all of the genealogy clues that it provides. So never ever underestimate them. And again, I said this earlier, a little too soon in my presentation, but going beyond names and dates turns genealogy into family history. So family history are the stories, and that's what we always want you to be able to find. So in order to help you find them, I want to go through some common mistakes and best practices when you're searching in newspapers. So first things first, let's talk about names. So names can be so tricky. I already touched on maiden names and searching for women ancestors. We're going to go into that a little bit more on the next slide. But the first thing that you need to understand is what the abbreviations were or the name variations. So I've got a few examples here on the left side. This is a very short list. It's a easy Google or AI search now, which I'm grateful for. You can say in 1802, what were common nicknames for Samuel? And, or how did printing press operators uh, put those characters in? And that's a big part of newspaper history. When they were working with printing presses, they had limited space and they had to hand set each of the letter keys. And so they abbreviated a lot for the sake of column space, for the sake of limiting characters, because there was a time that you paid by the number of lines or by the number of characters in a newspaper. So a lot of things were abbreviated. Understanding what was going on in that time is also important because there are many cases where an S would be listed as an F, and that was just common language for that time. So doing a bit of Google or AI research on the language of the time can go a long way in helping you find those names, because very often we give up because we didn't find it exactly as we know it. We don't find it as William, we find it as WM or Will or Bill or Billy or Bob or, Elizabeth has tons of nicknames because Elizabeth was such a common name. So that could be Eliza, a Liz, Lizzie, Beth, Betty. Um, I could go on with that. John being a Jack or JN in a newspaper, Margaret being Maggie or Peg, Dottie or Dot for Dorothy, Thomas, Patrick, the PATK or the PATR are very common abbreviations. So here's where wildcard searches come in, putting in the first few letters, then an asterisk. Those can help you sometimes find them. But really understanding names and taking the time to just think outside the box when it comes to that can really help your research. Another thing to understand if you are researching German heritage is that very often German immigrants changed their name to the literal translation of their name. So again, this is where Google is your friend. If you come from a family of Schwartz, you can just Google what is the literal meaning of Schwartz. And, for example, that means black. So you may see that, when they immigrated to the US, they changed their last name to Black, and that may impact your research, or reverse that. If you've got a family line of Black that all of a sudden drops off, then you might try, if you know that you're of German lineage, to start looking under Schwartz and see if that, is the direction that your family took. It's also really important to understand some of the myths surrounding name changes at Ellis Island. So it didn't really, we hear sometimes that people were forced to change names because they were difficult to pronounce, etc. That happens a lot less than we have been told. A lot of times when people change their names, it was voluntary. They wanted to assimilate into their new life. They wanted that kind of fresh start. Or, perhaps they were trying to not be found by creditors. So, sometimes it was a choice. They wanted to just start anew when they came to the US and volunteered to change their name. The tricky thing is that Ellis Island has only been required to document those changes since 1906. So prior to 1906, they may or may not be recorded. And that's when the, kind of critical thinking of understanding common name changes for that ethnicity or that race can come in handy to help you close some of those gaps and conquer those brick walls. Also look to newspapers for mentions of ship arrival. So even putting ship arrival in quotations in your keywords can help. Looking at those legal notices for new business ventures, looking into local events like church events, can lead you to church affiliation, which then can lead you to church records and so much more. So, looking into these kind of that time of immigration and the names is a very important skill to master in this work. Now, for women ancestors, I touched on this earlier, this is something that you might have to try 10 times. So, for my maternal grandmother, Arlene Conger, she did not have a middle name because it was very common for women born in that time to use their middle name or their maiden name as their middle name. She did that. My mother-in-law, Charlene, used her middle name or her maiden name as her middle name throughout life. They didn't have given middle names like people in my generation do. And so you have to sometimes try many different ways. So for her, here's just a few examples of how I might search for her, under her first name and last name as I knew her at the time of her death, looking for her first name and last name at the time of her birth, looking at for them combined, looking for them under my grandfather's name, and looking for them under an abbreviation of my grandfather's name. Also, researching any common nicknames or abbreviations for that time, searching by just initials, A. Anderson, A. Conger. Of course, Anderson's very, very common. And so, you might have to do some digging in that way. And then, of course, you can use your wildcard searches. It's also important to understand when you think you're hitting a brick wall, you might just have an error. So, same grandmother, I could not find her in the 1930 census. I knew that she was born in 1928. And so I was really surprised that I couldn't find her in the 1930 census. So I looked for her um, older brother, Clifford. And so I found this record here. And what I learned is that it was wrong. It was just wrong. So you can see that the census taker, you can see in the upper left how they clearly made their A in Anderson, and it's correct. But when they wrote my grandmother's name, they misheard or miswrote the A as an O. So she's listed as Orleen Anderson. So what this means is that this record is indexed correctly, but I cannot search for her because it's that's not how it's documented. It's not documented correctly. So while this index is technically correct, the record itself is wrong. And there's nothing we can do about a census that was written the wrong way. We can't petition to have it changed. So it's important to sometimes look at the next census to verify these things, or the prior census if you know they were still alive, to just compare and contrast. And in doing so I went to the 1940 census to see if that one was correct, and I found another interesting fact. So if you see before in 1930, the line above my grandmother is a son named Merlin. That is accurate. That is someone I've met in my life that I know that this record is correct. Here in the 1940, well, that census taker wasn't any better. They put Merlin as Marilyn and listed him as a daughter. So Merlin was born Merlin and stayed Merlin his entire life, but here he's listed as Marilyn. And so the 1940 is absolutely correct for my grandmother, but now it's incorrect for my great uncle. And so, going back and forth, sometimes it just takes a whole village of census records to get the family together. Now, here we see that 10 years later, they have 4 additional children. But what I found interesting here is that the youngest daughter, whose name was Valora, she was just listed as infant. So if you're hitting a dead end, if you know somebody should have been alive in that census period, try searching for infant. And especially if they were born on or around a census year, they may just not have been named yet. Or perhaps they counted that, person, like maybe they just got there the day that they were born or something. You never know what was going on with the census taker at that time, but maybe they just hadn't decided on a name yet. I know that my great grandfather was a rancher, so perhaps he wasn't home yet, and great grandma just didn't name the baby until grandpa had some input. So you don't really know the story of why that is, but it is an important thing to know it's possible. So always try to look before and after, go in either direction that makes sense for you in the census, because the census is full of mistakes. And, we had just normal humans like you and me going door to door with a clipboard, and it's all in cursive. It's difficult to read. So even if the census taker gets it all right, perhaps when it was indexed either by a volunteer or by AI, they didn't recognize the characters correctly. Now, index errors can usually be fixed, but the actual records themselves, if they're flawed, that's just how they're documented. It's also really important to not limit yourself when you're searching in newspapers. A great example of this, I just happened upon this when I was doing some random research. This was a wedding announcement that I found in a very small town in Utah that described a wedding that was taking place in Minneapolis from a couple that came from San Francisco. And I was like, what in the world? Why is this in Utah? It provided all kinds of great information, like the birth order of the groom, which, we don't always understand, we don't always get that this was the firstborn son or the secondborn son. It listed their college information, some of their career information, and things like that. But I couldn't figure out why it was in this little town in Utah. Well, it turns out that these people were in an internment camp. And so they listed their wedding announcement in that area for the people that were still there. So, understanding that your search can actually hurt you when you're looking in newspapers because news traveled. So I'm going to go through a kind of a step-by-step process for that, but I want to give you another example first. This is my late father-in-law, Jim Stinnett. Jim Stinnett played for the Denver Broncos in the 1960s. If that's not your team, I'm sorry. But we did an obituary for him here in Arizona when he passed away. I knew it existed, so I had all the information. So I just put it in. Yeah, I've got the name, I've got the location, I know where he worked, I got some great keywords. So I have all kinds of stuff I can put into my search criteria. And that search criteria can look like this. I've got his name, I've got the specific date, I'm looking for exact search here, I've got the keywords that I know we put in the obituary, and look what I get, no results. Well, I know this exists, so what in the world is going on? I'm just being way too specific. Now, the mistake that I made was Jim Stinnett was in quotations, and in the previous slide, I just kind of ran it all together. So it's looking for an exact search because I told it to. So I knew this existed. So I went back in, I changed my search, just put in the first name of Jim Stinnett in quotations so that it would look for them together. So if I just put first name of Jim and last name of Stinnett in the respective fields, I'm getting every Jim and every Stinnett. So a fun fact with any of your newspaper sites is that their fields are usually pretty flexible. If you put their name together, so Jim Stinnett, and put it in quotations, that tells the search algorithm to look for those two together, and that will absolutely help you out. So when I just did that and took out all the other stuff, I got 677 newspaper archives and 2 obituaries. I'm like, okay, that's starting to make more sense to me. So I took a quick look because he was a football player at the 677 newspaper archives. They were all 677 were about him from his football journey from high school, college, and the NFL. So that was just, I looked at football articles for a couple of days after that. But then I was looking for the obituary for my records. So, okay, 2 obituaries. That's great. I did find the one that I showed you here, the one that we listed, but I found a little surprise. Now, this obituary was listed in Corvallis, Oregon, nearly 3 months after his passing, and or more than 3 months after his passing, and after we listed the obituary. So, again, with that specific criteria, looking in Arizona, looking in April, looking, for specific things, I would have never in a million years found this Oregon obituary. Turns out that a hometown childhood friend of his learned about his death and put an obituary in a local newspaper where he grew up. What's beautiful about this is that, meeting a father-in-law was later in my life, obviously, and he was a second marriage to my mother-in-law. So he came into the picture later. So this obituary actually helped us learn some things that we did not know. He never once told us that he was in the National Guard. Never once. We had no idea that he had military affiliation at all. We also never knew that he played for a Canadian football league. Just never. And I mean, he talked about football all the time. We never learned that he played 7 games with 3 broken ribs. And, he was a humble man. And so he didn't brag about that stuff. But it does go on and talk about, his reason for death, that he donated his body for scientific research because of his concussions and head injuries from playing football. And so, this was all captured beautifully in an obituary that we never knew existed. I did not know this existed until 10 years after it was written. And so, it's really important to start broad and narrow things down. And just again, here are just a few of the great football articles that I found about him. So some of the steps to doing that, I sort of highlighted it, but I'm going to go step by step for you. And this is just so important on any newspaper site. Start with the first and last name only. If the name's not John Smith, if it's not super common, you can use the respective fields, first name, last name. But I almost 100% of the time put the first and last name in the same field with quotations around them. I want it to find them together. I don't want to sort through every Jim and every Stinnett. I'm just kind of a lazy researcher. So here, when I do first and last name, this is my maternal grandfather. I find 5,514 newspaper archives that contain that name, and 69 obituaries, plus some other categories that I'm not particularly interested in today, but I may look at later. 69 obituaries. I am patient enough to look through them, but I think I can do better. So I'm going to next step add just the date range of my grandfather's life. So he was born in 1928. He died in 2018. I am intentionally not putting in his exact date of birth. It could have been documented incorrectly. If I put in an exact date in any given time, I'm telling the newspaper site to only look for that date. So if it's ever wrong, if it's ever published, so maybe their date of birth isn't there, maybe it was published on in a Sunday paper and they were born on a Friday. And so it might just say, Robert Conger was born last Friday, and it may not have a date. You might have to do that math. So just using the years is the best practice to note here. So when I just put the year, the range of his life, I knock that down to 4,696 newspaper archives and 58 obituaries. I'm doing better, but I'm pretty lazy. I think I can narrow it down more. So here I go to the states that I know he lived in life. I know he passed away in Utah, but I know that he was also lived in Nevada for a period, and that he lived in California for a period of time. So I put those in, and that brought it down to 7 obituaries. Now that's great. I'm going to absolutely look at those. But I want to refine this just a little bit more. Now, on the Genealogy Bank website, on the search column that shows up on the left side of the screen, and I'm sorry I don't have a visual of it. I'll need to add that to this slide. It tells you how many hits come in for a certain state. So next to California and Nevada, I didn't have anything. There was another state that showed some information, but in Utah, it had these 7 obituaries. So I was like, well, let's narrow it down to just like the city, the area that he was in. So I took away the criteria for California and Nevada. Those didn't matter. I didn't have any hits for those 2 states, so I didn't really need them in my search criteria. Again, we're refining, we're trying to narrow things down. We're not trying to lock things out. So from there, I kept Utah because that's where my 7 hits were. And then I narrowed it down to just the Provo area. So he did not live in the city of Provo, but that's where the newspaper was. That was, the most likely to, that's a larger city that's adjacent to where my grandfather lived. So I put in Provo because that was just a guess at that time that that's where the paper was that I would find it. And I did find 3 obituaries, and all 3 of them are the correct person. All 3 of them are about my grandfather. Now, why are there 3, and why are they on 3 different dates? This is why we don't go too specific on our date range, because the first one is, these are a little bit written. The first one is our beloved father, Robert, has passed away peacefully in his home. That was written by the family. So that's the actual obituary that the family contacted the paper directly to have listed. Now, the next 2 are from the funeral home, and they were posted 2 days consecutively. So they are showing up on 2 different dates. So again, if I only had that specific date of death or date of service or a specific date, I would have made, it's possible that I wouldn't have found these. So it's very important to be kind of loose and flexible on these things. You also may find that the dates can be a little bit fluid when there's an error or a correction. Like if there's an editorial correction, then you might find the correct date was posted the next weekend, and and they've corrected the article. So, there are so many things that can happen with newspaper work. It's absolutely imperfect. So you have to be able to narrow down your search step by step in order to find what you're actually looking for. Because if we overload it, then we might have that 0 result that isn't actually true. And then we may say, oh, this site is terrible, or I can't find it. And it's really just our search practices that need a little bit of help and refining. It's also possible to search for things beyond names. So remember, I told you my husband was just very aloof and didn't have a lot of information. And so I'm like, well, I don't even want to do this. I'm, trying to plan a funeral. I've got family coming in. I've got to get food. And just a fun fact, when I was washing dishes prior to the funeral, the morning of, I put my hand inside of a glass and the glass broke, and I literally sliced my knuckle off and needed 9 stitches. So it was kind of a crazy day when he like last minute said, I want to add this to the thing for the funeral. So I go in and I look for, instead of using her name in the first name, again, remember the fields can be flexible. So I put in Wings because that was really the only thing that he absolutely knew, was that it was like Miss Wings or Wings of something. So I put in the word Wings as my primary search term. So this you can use for adoption. You can use things like ship arrival. You can use a topic here. You can even use World Series of 1964. It doesn't matter what you put in these fields. Go with what makes the most sense. He said to me the early 60s. So I put 1960 to 1965 as my range. And then I put her name or her maiden name at the time in my keywords field. Now, this may seem like I've totally got it backwards, and it may have worked the other way, but I really wanted to focus on I'm in a hurry, I'm having a hard time typing with stitches in my hand, and I've got stuff to do and family in town. So I just want to find the wings article and move on. So that's why I did it this way. I could have flip-flopped it and probably gotten the same result, but I wanted to show you this because it really is a great way to search that perhaps you haven't thought of. Now, what that did for me was one time. That's all I put in here. I got 18 newspaper archives, 0 obituaries, some census data. I didn't care about that right now. I want these articles. All 18 of these articles were about that one beauty contest and that she won. So this gave me so much more context. This was 18 articles from coast to coast, from New York to California. You see the third one down is Long Beach, California. Fourth one down is Buffalo, New York, Chicago, because she was from Chicago. They were different variations and different interpretations of the same beauty contest. Who knew this Miss Wings was such a big deal? It was an airline specific, so it was for airline stewardesses to compete. We learned that she was also second Miss runner-up in Miss Colorado, and so like we knew that she did these beauty contests, but we didn't really have the details. And so this was so fun. And I found so many great photos. So I was able to very quickly add to our slideshow for the funeral with 18 different articles representing this beauty pageant. And again, that wealth of information that I showed you earlier, that had I needed it for genealogy work, would have come in so useful. So try to change your searches up a little bit when you're stuck and see where you get. Um, as I mentioned, using that kind of keyword approach is a great way to find people who immigrated, who came here by ship. You can learn some dates, who else was on that voyage. You can learn the name of the ship and the dates and things like that. So these are really fun. So again, you could put ship arrival as your main search term, and then just put like the last name or the first initial last name in there, because again, we're abbreviating because we've got a long list of people. These things, they take patience. It all takes patience, but that's why we do it, because we want to know and we want to tell these stories. Um, just going back and touching one more time on those gossip columns. Um, again, these are sometimes listed as personal, sometimes, they're listed as society. So you can put those things into your keywords, but pay attention to them, because just in random, gossipy of who's doing what and, who went where and who's visiting so and who had a party, we learned like in the first article, if we're stuck on Mrs. Kennedy, what we find out is that there was a mix up, that she actually married Mr. Miller before or didn't. And, just, that this first marriage was, or the second marriage was illegal because there was a first marriage that nobody knew about or admitted or, whatever. And so like these splendid mix up here is actually kind of a cheeky article. But we did find out that Mary Thompson's second marriage to Harry Nichols is illegal because she married Kennedy before. And, and then kind of goes on as to, legally what happened. But turns out that she was dismissed and probably had to get a divorce before she married the new husband. Here, this is really just a baby shower, but it talks about adoption. So if you are looking for any adoption information, this isn't the adoption record, but you at least can get some of the whereabouts, the who's, the, other names to look at, different family members and, mother's name and things like that. So you can, you know, you can at least start piecing things together. And then again, these just, so-and-so visited their parents, visited their sister. Those can always give you some information. Like this one on the bottom talks about a job. a career thing. So they're a lot of fun. They tell the story, they build that richness in your family history. And, you just never know when you're going to find that common thread with an ancestor. A lot of sites, I can only speak for Genealogy Bank. I do know other sites pretty well, but I love to speak about Genealogy Bank. We have exclusive collections. So there's a couple things that I mentioned earlier a little bit. When you're searching within an ethnic group, if you can isolate the group a little bit into, if the site has collected the newspapers. So for example, Genealogy Bank has Hispanic American newspaper collection. So these are newspaper collections dedicated or direct targeted to a Hispanic area or a Spanish language. We have a complete, or not a complete, but we have a collection that is only German language newspapers. So a German community formed in the United States. And so their newspaper was written in the German language because they didn't speak English yet. And so, you can search just within that collection if you know that your family immigrated to one of those areas. So those will come in very useful. We have an African American collection that focuses on newspapers for African American people that has a lot of the slave information, the advertisements and things like that. Now, when we go into African American history and Native American history, wildcard searches with any ethnic group are going to be your friend because there are often unexpected or incorrect name spellings because maybe it didn't translate well or there was a language barrier or an accent that whoever was reporting on it or taking the information may have gotten confused. So you want to use wildcard searches to get the names right or to reveal the names. And then, understanding uncomfortable but common terminology for that time period. Words that we would not use today are going to be very common in earlier newspapers. So understanding that terminology, being obviously sensitive to it, and knowing where to look and what to look for to help you find that lineage. Because some of this can be extremely difficult. Educate yourself with things like subgroups. So you may be looking for the same ancestor as a free person or as a slave or as an indentured servant. So you may need to use certain keywords to find that person. We always recommend starting with the census, regardless of heritage. Some people were mislabeled, misidentified racially. They may be in a household as an indentured servant or as a employee of any kind. So, starting with the census is always good practice. And looking in newspaper articles and advertisements. So auction it's, again, very uncomfortable if this is your reality, very unfortunate, but these are some of the biggest roadblocks that people doing African American research find. So it's important to know that and to, be willing to expand some of your search to using those keywords. And that is, some general hints and tips for you today. For this group, we have a discount. You can go to this link if you are so inclined to start using Genealogy Bank to help complete your research. Some of these numbers need to be updated. We now have over 16,000 newspapers. We have over 326 million obituaries, one of the largest obituary collections. And over 95% of our content is unique to Genealogy Bank and can't be found anywhere else. We are a part of Newsbank, which is 52 years in business, and we provide news archives to universities and libraries across the world. So our collection is licensed, it's exclusive. We have very strong partnerships with publishing houses, and we do the archive work for many other news entities and news hosts. So we have very exclusive access to many collections. And so chances are, if you've exhausted your newspaper.com, you're just hitting dead ends, or your newspaperarchive.com, or Ancestry or Storied or any of the the large sites, that's okay. We don't consider them competitors. We all want you to find your family. We want you to find your stories. So we just know that there's just a time and a place that we're the best site for you. And there's a time and a place when we're not. And that's okay. So we have a 7-day free trial period. We also have a free, very limited, you just create a user ID and a password, and you just skip the part where it asks you to pay. You can log into the site. You can use the Social Security Death Index. You can use, you can see our newspaper collection. So if you're just looking for a specific newspaper in an area, then you can go in and search for it for free. You don't have to sign up. You just need to have a login. And our support team is literally, I confidently say, the best in the industry. We can be reached at support@genealogybank.com, by chat on genealogybank.com, or at the number there. My name is Melanie. I am the Senior Director of Consumer Support, and I thank you for allowing me to speak to your group today. And I am available for questions now.
If you have a question, if you type it into the chat and we'll read it to Melanie and see if we can get some answers for you. Just a note that if you came into the presentation late, this presentation is being recorded and will be available on the OGS website for a period of time. So you'll be able to come back and check into it later.
I do see something in the chat. Let's see if it's a question.
You've got some kudos, Melanie.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I'm so glad that you use us. We thank you for that. And Cheryl, if you aren't already, we love to give a loyalty discount. So before your next renewal, either chat in or email us and say, hey, Melanie said I could get a loyalty discount, and we'll be more than happy to do that for you.
Well, if nobody has any questions, we're getting a lot of kudos, so that's great. But if nobody has any questions, we'll cut Melanie loose and thank her again for joining us today. And thank you for everybody at Genealogy Bank for being willing to give this program to us today.
Absolutely. And then I believe we furnished you with a door prize. So just let me know who won that, and we will get them set up for their free year.
I will be sure to do that. Thank you.
Okay.
All right.
Thanks again.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.